All right, well, hello 8th graders and welcome to this video lecture, which is going to introduce us to Bohr diagrams and also focusing on how electrons fill those orbitals or those electron shells around the nucleus. Okay, we've talked briefly about that, but Bohr diagrams really hone us in on this kind of other aspect of atomic structure. So to dig in here, we see a version of the periodic table, and the best way to explain Bohr diagrams and how to make them is obviously to do an example. So we're going to focus on element 16 here, which is sulfur. Okay, now if we look at sulfur, we're given some information in this periodic block. The first piece of information is this number 16, and this is our atomic number. And remember that the atomic number is the number of protons that we have in that atom. Okay, the other piece of information that we're given here is the atomic mass. Now, we've been talking about this term called mass number, right? And we can kind of use atomic mass and mass number interchangeably. However, you'll notice that this atomic mass number that you're given, it is not a nice, neat whole number. It's actually a decimal, right? Well, to get the mass number from this atomic mass number, all we have to do is do some simple rounding. And hopefully you understand rounding from mathematics. So in this case, for sulfur, the mass number that we would end up with is going to be equal to 32. Okay, so all I did was I took that 32.1, I used my basic math principles for rounding, I rounded down to 32. Okay, and now remember that the mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in that atom. Okay, now at this point, let's jump into creating a Bohr diagram for sulfur. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to draw a circle. And this circle is going to represent our nucleus. Now remember that in the nucleus we have protons and we have neutrons. And what we want to do is we want to show the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus of that atom in our Bohr diagram. So, first things first, the protons should be easy. We're given the atomic number of sulfur. We know that the atomic number is the number of protons, so I am going to write a 16 in here. Now, to determine the number of neutrons, again, let's use our mass number, okay? We know that the mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So all we're going to do is we are going to take 32, which was our mass number, minus 16, which was our number of protons, and that is going to give us 16 neutrons. So I'm going to write that in to my nucleus. Okay, so that's maybe the easiest part of a Bohr diagram. Now, the more difficult part and the most important part of a Bohr diagram is being able to show how many electrons that element has, and also show where those electrons are located in terms of the orbitals or the electron shells that an atom of that element has. So, on the periodic table here, all of the atoms of the elements on the periodic table are considered to be neutral, meaning that they have no charge, okay? So their net charge is 0. Now let's remember that protons and electrons contribute to the net charge. So if this atom of sulfur has 16 protons For it to be neutral, it has to have 16 electrons. Okay, so sulfur has 16 electrons, and that's kind of our symbol right there for electrons, just an E with a negative. Okay, so sulfur has 16 electrons. We need to place those 16 electrons around this sulfur nucleus. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I am going to draw an orbital. I'm going to draw an electron shell. And I'm going to place some electrons in this electron shell. Now, if you remember from that build an atom simulation, I had you try and see how electrons actually fill these orbitals. And hopefully you notice that only two electrons fill that first shell. So that knocks out 2 of the 16 electrons that sulfur has. So we have to add another shell. Okay, so there's orbital or electron shell number 2. Now in that build an atom simulation, you were given 10 electrons. The second orbital of an atom can only hold 8 electrons. So how we're going to fill this next shell, we're going to start at 12 o'clock. And we are going to add an electron there. We will add an electron here. We'll add one at 6. And we'll add one at 3. Now, if we stopped here, what do we have? We have 6. So we've knocked out 6 of the 16 electrons that sulfur has. But again, the second orbital can hold 8 electrons. So we'll go back to 12. And we'll add another. We'll add another here. We'll add another here. And we'll add another here. So now if we're counting, we have 10. We have 10 of the 16 electrons. So what do we have to do? We have to add a third orbital, a third electron shell. So now again, we've knocked out 10 of sulfur's 16 electrons, so we have to add 6 to this third shell. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we will go 5 and 6. And right here is the completed Bohr diagram for sulfur. So the Bohr diagram shows a few different things. It shows the number of protons and neutrons that we have in the nucleus. It shows us how many orbitals that particular atom has. In this case, sulfur has 3 electron shells or orbitals. It also shows us how many electrons that atom has and where those electrons are located. Now, rules in terms of how those electron shells or those orbitals are filled. The first shell, the one that is closest to the nucleus, can only hold 2 electrons. The second shell can only hold 8 electrons. And then for our purposes, and this is as high as we're going to get in terms of the number of shells that an atom has, our third shell can also hold 8 electrons. Okay, so those are your rules. This is super important when we create Bohr diagrams. We need to know how many electrons those orbitals or those shells can hold. So with this information, do your best to complete the Bohr's bones activity sheet. hang on to that until we see each other next week, and we will go through the work that you do. Take care, 8th grade students. Have a great weekend.